We're now working on our interval practice. We're going to be down here on the G note. It's located on the 5th string down. If you count down from the top of the guitar, fret number 8, it's on the B string. So that when we're going to do the same shape, but now we're orientating around a different note, which means you can kind of think of it as all the different intervals that you can use to build chords that would be in the same key as the C major, which if I orientate around the G would be the G Mixolydian. So this is the first one that we've gone into, or this is the first presentation of most likely 3 on this particular note as we go through all of the intervals. So we want to get a little bit more of an in-depth recap on why we would want to learn the intervals in terms of, number 1, having the same shape that we are building multiple different ways. So if I'm building the same shape, you might be thinking, why am I looking at the intervals? What's the point of looking at the intervals? So I want to kind of understand that in my mind. I also want to be thinking, why would I be learning the Mixolydian mode? That's a pretty common mode, but it's also one that even if people play it, they might not realize that they're playing it because they might be tweaking the major mode to basically a Mixolydian mode. So it'd be nice if we knew consciously that we are doing that, so that if we're talking to people or if we're thinking about it in our mind, we can then think about it from multiple perspectives, remembering from my perspective, being able to see things from multiple perspectives is the definition of understanding it. So again, if you've ever taken like a math class or something like this, I know a lot of people don't like math, maybe that are in guitar or whatever. You don't need a lot of math here. I'm not saying you need a lot of math, but you do need some visualization of shapes and whatnot. That's kind of what is happening here, which has spatial reasoning and whatnot, like video game kind of understanding and that spatial reasoning type of thing. And now I forgot what I was talking about with my math metaphor. Let me think for a second. Okay, I remember what I was thinking. You know, when you're like learning a new concept in math and you feel like you understand it, you get the concept, but you see how to do it one particular way. And basically my argument used to be, I would do this in like Spanish class and all the classes. I'd be like, well, I know how I do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to how other people think they're saying it, and then I will try to reorientate what they're saying into my perspective so I can see it in this one particular way. And so all of my effort was to try to interpret what other people are doing to the way I see it. And note that is a good practice because you're still interpreting other perspectives, but really that means you don't really understand it that well because you can only see it from one particular angle. It'd be a lot better if you can see it from multiple different angles. So what I practiced wanting to be able to do then for myself and, to communicate with others is I'd like to be able to see it from any perspective that is a legitimate perspective, right? So if someone else says, I see it this way, I'd like to be able to say, oh, I can see how that works. I can see how you're seeing it from that perspective and possibly then introduce other perspectives, right? Now, if they tell me something that's wrong, I also want to be able to say, oh, I see how you're looking at it, but that's wrong, I think, and this is logically why it's wrong. And if you're talking about something like math or guitar intervals, you can say something is wrong because if it doesn't add up, it's wrong, right? Again, there's nothing wrong in terms of what you play stylistically. That's different. You might like something or not like something, but if we're trying to measure a particular interval and someone says it's 3 notes away instead of 4 notes away, then it's wrong definitionally, right? And you're able to say that, right? Okay, so that's going to be the idea. So we want to be able to, I want to be able to kind of do that, and I also want to be able to measure once again from the bottom of the guitar. So let's give a comparison of the Mixolydian mode, which is also a mode that's highly associated with like blues type of stuff. If you're into that kind of thing, then we can scroll up to the top. Remember, I'm gonna compare everything to the major scale. So we're looking at the same scale, which is you can call it a C major scale, which has all the other modes. I usually play in A minor as a guitar player because I learned this one shape right here, pentatonic shape, and then the 7 note, right? But that means that just like if you're on the piano and you learn the C major scale, you might think, well, that's boring. You only know one scale, but you really are picking up. If you learn that shape, you could play all of the modal related modes related to it because they all have all the same notes to it. So we're working in the same shape. Now on the piano, it's a little bit wonky to shift from the C major to say the D major and all related modes. Why? Because there's not a uniform spacing of the white notes and the black notes. The piano is laid out in the key of C major, which means that all the black notes are the half steps. So if you shift everything up, then although the wholes and halves ship up in a uniform fashion like on a spreadsheet, it's not going to be perfect with regards to where the half steps lie with the small notes. On the guitar, it is a perfect shift up, right? So again, you can't really do that like with your fingers. It's not like I can play this position and then I'm just going to take this whole fretboard and shift that shape up in my mind. I can do that in theory. I can't do it tectonically. I can't do it with my fingers as easy because I'll have to learn the new position. But if I know it in theory, it'll be easier to get my fingers to do it, right? So that's going to be, that's why I keep on working in this one position. This one position works well because it has a check figure, meaning if I hit a flat or a sharp note, then I'm out of key technically, whether I'm playing in C major or any of the related modes. That gives me kind of like an internal control from an accountant standpoint if something is out of whack, right? And I have that, and I have the nice beauty of this being what many people call a position 1, which you might call a G-shaped C position if you want to use the caged system, in which case I have to name it after the major scale, because here's the G shape for a C chord right there. And that position happens to be right in the middle of the guitar, which is perfect because that allows us to grow naturally up both sides of the guitar rather than learning down here, which is good too if you're learning open positions, but then you can only grow up this side of the guitar. I can't learn anything behind this position because I run into the nut, right? That's why A minor, C major on position 5 is like, I think, the ideal position to learn intervals because it's right in the middle of the guitar and we can reach basically back and forth within it. Noting that when I want to move around on this guitar, then how can I do that? How can I learn the shapes? Well, I can learn the shapes. I can cut the fretboard into 5 shapes, which is quite common. Those tie into the shapes of an open position chords, and they do that because of the tuning of the guitar, which is tuned so it fits 4 to 5 fingers, because we have 4 to 5 fingers. That's why everything fits within 4 to 5 fingers. It was designed to do that. So that means I could name those 4 to 5 cut particles or chunks of the fretboard based on the caged system, as we saw here, calling this a C major G-shaped position, and then add from a 3-note shape or a 3-note chord to a 5-note pentatonic, adding 2 more notes to the 7-note shape for the full major chord or scale, as well as all of the other octaves, right? So that's one way that we can do it. But if I learn it by shape, I often don't know the notes. Remember, and I'm not so concerned with the notes themselves as I am with the relative positions. So that's why we name it with the first, the second, the third. Why? Because if I move from C major to D major, if I memorized all the notes in C, that's not going to transpose when I go up to D major. What will transpose is the relative positions, right? That's why we learn, the relative positions. So I can also basically learn this I can build this shape by what we call formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, which most people only learn from the major scale, which means they're very limited. We're limited to build this from that formula if I can't also build it from position 2, meaning build it from the perspective of the Dorian scale, which just means I build the same shape from the second bit. So we might talk about that in a whole nother course or section. And then I want to learn the intervals, which means I can choose any shape and I can build the intervals around that shape, kind of like drawing a circle around the shape for all the intervals, name all the intervals that are related to that shape, and that's another way that I can build this shape. And if I do that, I can choose each note and build around that shape. I can build the same shape using any of the points in that shape as the pivot point. Like if I had a compass, I'm drawing a circle around it, right? And that's what we're doing here. That is particularly good for learning chords, because that means I learn, you can think of all of these intervals as like a 2-note chord. Some people will debate that you can't have a 2-note chord, but a power chord is basically a 2-note chord, because most chords have 3 notes. I don't want to get into that mess, but we can basically call it like a 2-note chord. And then of course, if I compile more of those intervals in relation to the center point, I can make a 3-note chord or a 4-note chord, right? And I can pick all the notes that are in the key that we are in. All right, so that's going to be the general idea. Now note that you might not play in Mixolydian a lot. The reason I say that a lot of people do play in Mixolydian, although they might not know they play in Mixolydian, is because many people like to play in a blues kind of thing, which is fun, really fun thing to do. When you play in a blues, every time I get to the Mixolydian, I kind of want to point this out. What you can do then is oftentimes there's different kind of conventions with the thing with the blues thing that's kind of funny is that it's kind of a wonky thing. It's kind of if you learn poetry and it has a particular meter in the poetry, right? Like Shakespeare has his whatever poetry meter that he has, but he doesn't always use that, right? Or if you have a nursery rhyme, you have a poetry, but you don't always stick exactly to the meter, because if you change the meter a little bit, then it makes it wonky. It's a little out of touch, right? So that means that if I do something that's a little wonky, then as long as it's still structurally sound, then it sounds cool. And the blues is like the major, until they went to jazz and went way crazy. The blues was the epitome of that to some degree, right? Because it's basically blurring the line between a minor scale and a major scale by blurring the third, and it's blurring the seventh mainly. So that means, and so we could kind of think of it, some people think of it as this position 1, and we think of that, and we try to bend that position 1 into basically a major position. In that case, I'd be playing from A blues, and we can bend. So I don't want to get into that too much. That's a whole nother thing, but I just want to point that out because a lot of people think about that. And that's why this position 1 is so ubiquitous, because it was used like, I think the idea was that it was like the position that people knew. And so they kind of designed their whole playing system around that position. So that's kind of a cool way to do it, because then you get these bends in place and whatnot. That's kind of cool. But the other way to basically see it is that you're going to be in like the C, like in our case, we're looking at a C major, right? So if I was using this shape, I usually think of it as an A minor or a C major. So if I was in the C major, I can take the major scale, and I can basically take the third of the major scale, and I can go back and forth between, that's like the blues note, between the minor third and the major third. That's one of the things that we can do. And then we can also take the seventh. We can take the seventh in the major scale, and I can flatten it to a minor 7. That's one of the major components. So if I was to do that, then basically I converted this C to a Mixolydian, in essence, because a Mixolydian scale has all the same intervals as a major scale, except we basically flat the 7, right? So when I'm thinking about, I want to play in a bluesy kind of thing, one way I can think of it is say, well, if I know this position well, I know that the major scale is the C major, and I can just take that C major and look for the 7 of it, which is this B right here, and then I can flatten it. So I can flatten it. What would I have done if I did that? I'm basically then converting that C major scale into a C Mixolydian scale, is basically what's happening, right? And then, or I can also take this same shape that's in, I know this shape, which is C major and the related modes, and say I want to play something bluesy. Well, instead of choosing the C and then flattening the 7 and then mixing in the minor third and the major third, I could just say, well, maybe I should go to the Mixolydian mode. I'll just play a G blues. So in that case, if I play it here, then I'm going to go down and say, well, then I'll just go to the Mixolydian, right? And the Mixolydian is just like the major scale, but it already has a flat 7. So in that case, I don't need to flat the 7 because it's already a flat 7. In that case, right, if I was playing in the key of G, then I might take that flat 7 and mix in to blur in the major 7 as I move back up home, right? Because I have this bluesy, so that would be, right? So I can kind of do that, and then I can always throw in that third, right? So, you know, we could throw in the third. So that's going to be, so I could play it in the Mixolydian. Now you could do the same thing with the Lydian because it's the other major mode. So you could try and say, well, I'm going to take the Lydian, which has a major 7, and flatten it. And that would probably work well, but that's not as common because it's got that funny augmented fourth. So, but that means that no matter what shape you know, whether you know the C major and related modes, or the D major and related modes, or whatever, the G major and related modes, there's at least 1 to 2 of the notes in the scale that you can practice playing kind of a bluesy thing in. But as you do it, what you want to be thinking is, am I playing in a major scale? If I am, then what am I doing? Then I want to focus in on the third and the 7 to put in that flat 7. Or I can look at the minor, I can look at the Mixolydian, in which case I already have the flat 7, and I might want to smear in the major 7 as I go home, is going to basically be the general idea. Now also just realize that the other funny thing about the blues is that when we go from chord to chord, so if you go to the 1 chord to the 4 to the 5, 1, 4, 5, then we always, it's almost like you're switching from a Mixolydian to a Mixolydian to a Mixolydian, because each of the ones that we switch to, we're going to put in a flat 7. So in other words, if I was playing in the C major blues, what would I be doing? I'd be playing in the key of C, but I would be flattening the 7, right? So when I flatten the 7, that note is out of the key of a C major. And then when I go to the 4, I would normally be in Lydian, but I also need to flatten the 7. So basically I kind of converted it to a Mixolydian, right? And then when I go to the 5, it's the only one that actually has a flat 7. So I don't have to add then the flat 7. So you can kind of think of it as a parallel construction. What you're doing is you're basically going the 1, 4, 5 as though you're going from the Mixolydian is the 1, the Mixolydian is the 1, right? When you go from the C, you go C Mixolydian, and then you're really going to like an F Mixolydian, and then you're going to like a G Mixolydian, as opposed to going to C major, then to F Lydian, and then G Mixolydian. Now note, like if you don't know anything about the modes, that would make absolutely no sense, right? Because you've learned the convention, and this is where this modal kind of construction is important. The convention we normally learn is, well, I know all the notes in the key, right? And then what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to build chords on it. And normally we think about chords as 1, 3, 5. The third of the chord here is the defining factor as to whether it's major or minor. Most people then learn that the 1, 4, 5 builds a major chord, and the 2, 3, and 6 build a minor chord. Now the problem with that when we get to the blues is that we get a 7, and the 7 doesn't follow the normal convention, right? So there's a couple problems with learning that way, One is that you're stuck playing in the major scale, because I don't know which chord goes where if I played anything other than the major scale, because I just memorized that the 1, 4, 5 is major and the 2, 3, and 6 is minor, which is like a math shortcut that works sometimes but doesn't work all the time. And also, if I go beyond the 1, 3, 5, such as the 7, I don't know which 7 fits, right? So if I was just playing here and someone showed me a major blues in the key of C, I'd be like, well, wait a sec, the 7 that you're using doesn't fit because you used a flat 7, right? So I have to know, if I knew modally what happened, it would make sense, right? So I'm going to say, well, this is a C major, therefore the 7 has a 11 note away major 7, and if I did a bluesy thing, I would have to flatten the 1. And then if I go to the 4, normally this is an F, which is basically the Mixolydian chord. This would be the Mixolydian chord, which normally has a major 7, therefore I would have to flatten it. But when I go to the 5, if I know that that's the Mixolydian modal chord, then I know that it already has a flat 7, because that's the differentiating factor. So you see, the problem here is the 7 doesn't follow the normal convention of all the major chords have a major 7 and all the minor chords have basically a flat 7. See, that's where we run into the problems. Now with the blues, everything is more like parallel. So we're not really going from an Ionian modal chord to a Lydian modal chord to a Mixolydian modal chord, but instead we're going kind of more like a Mixolydian jumping to another Mixolydian scale, jumping to another Mixolydian scale. That makes it all uniform in terms of everything's kind of parallel, but everything is not in the same key. And those are the two ways that we can kind of mess around with playing. Do I want to be playing something, and when I jump to the next chord, I play in a whole nother scale that happens to be the same scale? Like I go from C major to, then when I go to the 4, I go to F major, and then when I go to the 5, I go to G major. It would be the same for the 1, 3, 5, but it will differ if we go to the 7, 9, 11, and 13, if we have a more complex chord that we're putting in play here. So that's going to be, those are some of the things we want to kind of keep in mind as we go here. Now also, if I play at the bottom of the guitar, this is the fault line, and so we shift everything at the bottom to the right. This tectonic plate moved to the right. So that also gives us practice to kind of measure the intervals that cross this tectonic plate as we focus down here on, I think we're going to be focusing in on this G. All right, so how do we learn the intervals? We'll learn the major intervals, and then we'll learn where the Mixolydian differs from the major intervals. So the major has a 0 note away perfect first, a 2 note away major second, a 4 note away major third, a 5 note away perfect fourth, a 7 note away perfect fifth, a 9 note away major sixth, and an 11 note away major 7. We're now going to go to the fifth, which is a Mixolydian. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna name the modes based on the relative position of the major scale. So when I think of Mixolydian, I think of it as absolute mode number 5. And that means that it's the 5th position related to the major scale, which helps me to at least know that I build a major chord from it, because the 1, 4, 5 is major, right? And so if I go to Mixolydian, it's going to have one interval difference. So when I build a Mixolydian mode, which you could also think of building a Mixolydian chord, it's going to have a different 7. So the idea would be this: if I was playing in C major, not blues, just normal, I'm playing in the key of C major, and I'm saying, okay, I have all of these available to me, and I would have the 7. If I built a 7 chord, the 7 then would be an 11 note away major 7. But then if I went to the 5, notice what would happen. If I want to be in the same key, I can't build the same parallel chord construction adding the 7, because the 7 would be a flat 7. So therefore, what I want to be able to do is say, when I go to the 5, I'm really playing a Mixolydian chord if I want to stay in the same key. That's my choice, right? I can either play a Mixolydian chord adding a flat 7, staying in the same key, or I can go to the 5 and play the related G major chord, which means that I'm not going to flatten the 7. I'm playing a note that is outside of the key of C major, but does fit in G major, and therefore it'll have a parallel chord construction. The shape will be the same. The shape will be exactly the same, right? But all the notes will not be in the C major chord in related modes. Those are the choices. Those are the two kind of options that we have. All right, so let's go down to the Mixolydian then and say, okay, what's the differences with the intervals? We still have a perfect first. We still have a 2-note away major second. We still have a 4-note away major third. We still have a 5-note away perfect fourth, a 7-note away perfect fifth, a 9-note away major sixth, but we have a 10-note away major 7, which is normally what we have in a minor interval, as opposed to the major scales that have an 11-note away major 7. So the Mixolydian is a major scale, but has a minor interval on the 7th, flattening the 7th, having a 10-note away minor 7th, which is equivalent to all of the minor modal chords, right? Which is the Dorian, the Phrygian, and the Aeolian, otherwise known as the minor scale. All right, so we're going to be measuring around this G note here, and we're going to be practicing our intervals, which is, it's different, remember, because we're practicing the intervals from the bottom of the guitar. Most people only practice their intervals from the top of the guitar, and they can't really say their intervals above the note because they don't know the inverse intervals, and they don't know how to count from string to string because they don't know the distance between strings, and we get confused when we go behind or up front to the top of the guitar. It also gets confusing when the fault line is here and we go above or up above the fault line. So every time we go down a string, we're doing a whole lot of new intervals, even in terms of shapes, even though we're doing a lot of the same intervals in the different modes that we're going through. All right.